Mute everybody. Make sure everybody is muted. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start now. Greetings and welcome, everyone. I'm so happy you decided to join us for this special day commemorating the life and work of one of the most important seers of our epoch, Rudolf Steiner. My name is Gelareh Khoie, and I'm the founder of Kosmos Institute, an online school dedicated to the expansion of consciousness through deep engagement with hidden knowledge systems and archetypal verities. After years of dreaming about it, I finally started the school in late 2023 in response to the pretentious dysfunction and financial inequities of higher education. One of my favorite authors at the moment is Pandit Rajmani Tikkunayat, a realized master from the Himalayan tradition who teaches and writes on yoga and tantra. In his talk entitled The Spirit of the Upanishads, he explains that as human beings, we live in two worlds simultaneously. One world is the outer world of day-to-day material reality. The other is the hidden world of archetypal transpersonal reality. The first is temporal and finite, the second, eternal and infinite. Both worlds exist together as one, are intertwined in complex ways, and inform one another. Panditji explains that to live awakened, useful, and purposeful lives, we must fully recognize, understand, and ultimately respect the rules and conditions of both worlds. That we must be constructive and awakened citizens of both worlds. Yet in most of our human cultures on the planet today, there's rarely a cogent mention of this second hidden world, let alone reliable educational systems to adequately teach us its rules, conditions, and ways. So, we're a wildly powerful species, adept at living in and manipulating the material world, but complete ignorant fools with regard to the other. This fundamental disparity is the root cause of all our troubles. Doing my small part to rectify this is why I founded Kosmos Institute. My ultimate aim is to help as many people as possible bravely overcome the age-old obstacles that prevent them from recognizing the truth. That our cosmos is beautiful, abundant, and joyful, and that our lives within this reality have genuine meaning, value, and purpose. During my 8 years of coursework at Pacifica Graduate Institute, I was fortunate to study with a handful of enlightened teachers. From the moment I met him, I knew I wanted to study with Dr. Daniel Joseph Polikoff long term. Not only was he a Rilke scholar, which is the dreamiest of all possible subject matters, he was an absolutely masterful teacher. Indeed, it was his remarkable and subtle power as a teacher that made him stand out for me. As soon as Kosmos Institute was born, I asked Dr. Polikoff to join me in its ongoing development. I'm delighted to call him my teacher and colleague. In addition to his diverse book publications, Daniel Joseph Polikoff's poems and translations have appeared in over 70 journals, as well as several anthologies, and earned him a Pushcart Prize nomination from the Louisiana Review. A Rilke scholar, he has presented on the poet at numerous venues over many years. The recipient of a PhD in comparative literature from Cornell University and a diploma in Waldorf education from Rudolf Steiner College, Dr. Polikoff has taught at Waldorf High Schools, Sonoma State University, and the California Institute of Integral Studies. He is presently an adjunct professor at the Jungian and Archetypal Studies program at Pacifica Graduate Institute and serves as core faculty at Kosmos Institute. Please welcome Dr. Daniel Joseph Polikoff.
Thank you, Gelareh. Rudolf Steiner was certainly a remarkable seer and one who paid very close and very conscientious attention to both of the worlds Gelareh mentioned, and most importantly, how they interact. Before introducing Bruce, I would just add that I was also a longtime Waldorf parent and the husband of a eurythmist, so my own personal engagement with Rudolf Steiner has been an ongoing one in many ways for many years. I'm delighted to be here on this momentous occasion celebrating and honoring the 100th anniversary of Rudolf Steiner's death. And I'm delighted too to introduce Bruce Donehower, a colleague who will introduce us further to the brilliance and range of Rudolf Steiner as a man and spiritual guide. Bruce himself is a scholar of British and German Romanticism, with a special interest in German early Romanticism and Novalis. He retired from university teaching a few years ago and is now the North American representative to the School for Spiritual Science at the Goetheanum for the section for the Literary Arts and Humanities. The Goetheanum, for those of you who may not know, is the center of anthroposophy. At present, it's a large double-domed building in Dornach, Switzerland. The original wooden structure was burned to the ground on New Year's Eve, only a year or so after it was completed. For more information on Bruce and the section and its research interests, or the upcoming Literary Arts Section Conference in San Francisco in early May, please do visit the website, theliteraryarts.com, and that's 3 words continuously, theliteraryarts.com. You'll find many riches on that site pertaining to Rilke, Novalis, and other featured writers. And I'll just close by mentioning that Bruce, in addition to his academic credentials, is himself an author. I remember many, many years ago reading his very wonderful imaginative fiction child book. I think it's called The Singing Tree, to my young children. So his interest in especially fairy tales, imaginative tales, is very deep, and he's a practitioner in that genre, as well as a poet himself. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Bruce. The way the day will be structured, Bruce is going to speak and introduce Steiner to us in his words, and then immediately thereafter, I'll give a presentation, and we'll save question and answer and discussion with the both of us after we both share about Rudolf Steiner. Bruce.
All right, well, thank you, Daniel, and greetings, dear friends, on what is a very stormy, windy new moon day here on Rudolf Steiner's 100-year anniversary day in Northern California. I'm in Northern California. So the title of my 45-minute talk today is, Who is Rudolf Steiner for our 21st century? And this will be a very brief general introduction to one of the more remarkable and controversial geniuses of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Controversial in his time and in our time, but in different ways. Now, until recently, Rudolf Steiner was invisible in the academy, despite his impact on a variety of disciplines at the beginning of the 20th century, and despite his voluminous writings and lectures and original contributions to art, architecture, literature, medicine, education, agriculture, Western esotericism and spirituality, etc. The list goes on. Now, you may know other polymaths and clairvoyants, such as, for example, Emanuel Swedenborg, who had a similar impact on European and North American cultural history and literature and history of ideas. Well, these remarkable individuals have been assimilated into the academy and acknowledged and studied. But until recently, not Rudolf Steiner. And I have to say that as an academic, I was always puzzled by this. And I'm speaking now about my experiences in the later part of the 20th century, since, as you see, I'm not a young man. During my years at the academy, first as a doctoral candidate and then as a professor, I was always surprised that a cloak of invisibility hung over Rudolf Steiner. Now, even my colleagues who were very excited by Owen Barfield, they could not see or acknowledge Rudolf Steiner. And if you're a Barfield fan, then you know that Owen Barfield was frank about his unbridled enthusiasm for Rudolf Steiner. He did not prevaricate. Barfield told his readers that he was a staunch anthroposophist, and he was a defender of anthroposophy and Rudolf Steiner, and a leading member of the Anthroposophical Society in Britain. But as Barfield said, despite his efforts, many people just could not see or refused to see Rudolf Steiner. Now, this is the first observation about Rudolf Steiner that I think needs to be pointed out at the beginning of any brief introduction to his life and work, and that is Rudolf Steiner's invisibility in the academy in the 20th century, despite the enormity of his breadth of activities. And the second observation, it's perhaps related to this first observation, is that Rudolf Steiner has always provoked a lot of criticism, if not outright enmity. As Daniel said, the first Goetheanum, which was one of the really architectural masterpieces of the modernist years of the early 20th century, it was burned down by an arsonist, an enemy of Rudolf Steiner and anthroposophy, for example. But I should modify my statement to say that criticism or enmity toward Rudolf Steiner really only applies to the last 25 years of his life, when he was active as a teacher of theosophy and anthroposophy. During the earlier 4 decades of his life, up until the beginning of the 20th century, he really did not attract much attention. And if he had not found his audience in theosophy and become a teacher of anthroposophy, well, I doubt that anyone outside of persons with a specialty academic interest in minor topics of 19th century Germanistics would know very much about him. So even though Rudolf Steiner had a very active literary career prior to the 20th century, he didn't really get anywhere. And it's as a teacher of the wisdom tradition known as anthroposophy that Rudolf Steiner has achieved enduring fame. And it's as a teacher in this wisdom tradition of Western esotericism and its wisdom literatures and traditions, it's in a teacher in that tradition that he has revealed his unique and exceptional genius. And accordingly, as Western esotericism and its wisdom literatures and traditions have become more respectable topics of research in the academy in recent decades, so too Rudolf Steiner has become more respectable as a research topic in the academy as well. For example, during this 100-year anniversary of Rudolf Steiner's death, the Harvard Divinity School has organized a multi-day symposium. And since this symposium is very much connected to our theme, I'll just read from the call for papers announcement and show it to you. Let me do a screen share here. Okay, you should be seeing this call for papers announcement from the Harvard Divinity School. Let me just read it. As the driving force behind the esoteric and social reform movement of anthroposophy, Rudolf Steiner left behind a complicated and trans-regional legacy. Following a 20-year period that has seen a huge increase in the quality and quantity of the scholarship on Steiner and anthroposophy, the centennial of Rudolf Steiner's death in 1925 offers a perfect opportunity for scholars and practitioners in areas of applied anthroposophy, such as Waldorf education, biodynamic agriculture, and interested members of the public to come together to debate major issues. While much of the key scholarship is still only available in German, the last decade or so has also seen breakthroughs in Anglophone publications in the field, such as Peter Staudenmayer's Anthroposophy and the Politics of Race in the Fascist Era, Dan McCannon's study of anthroposophy and the history and future of environmentalism, Helmut Sander's article on Rudolf Steiner and the Zeitgeist around 1900, and also significant publications in English translation, such as Martina Maria Sam's The Library of Rudolf Steiner. Our conference goal is to offer new perspectives on Steiner and critical approaches to his legacy, which has been extremely fruitful in multiple fields, from education and organic farming to modern art and architecture. By bringing together a diverse range of scholars and researchers, we hope to shed new light on this legacy and provide a forum to explore complex issues. Okay, that's the announcement. And what are these complex issues? Well, let me show you the list of panels at the symposium. This will give you a good idea of the breadth of the topic. Panel 1, Contested Beginnings, Disputed Anthroposophical Biographies, alongside Steiner's own biography, papers on other first and second generation anthroposophical leaders. Panel 2, Steiner's philosophical outlook. How were Steiner's philosophical writings, including the very important philosophy of freedom, shaped by Fichte, Nietzsche, idealism, etc.? That would be German idealism. Panel 3, Steiner's Goethean vision of participatory research and spiritual science. Did Goethe offer Steiner a new way of doing natural science? Panel 4, Steiner's activities within the Theosophical Society. That's about a 12-year period or so. How did Steiner adapt, transform, or distort Rosicrucian, Freemasonic, Theosophical elements in crafting his own esoteric and organizational practice? It goes on. Panel 5, Social threefolding, politics, economy, and community. Did Rudolf Steiner promote an anti-statist democracy or take an anti-democratic turn? Panel 6, Esotericism, evolution, race, and racism. Did Steiner's teachings about spiritual bodies and cultural epochs constitute a spirituality for the modern world, or was it a spiritualization of early 20th century prejudices? Panel 7, Waldorf pedagogy and curative education. Panel 8, Rudolf Steiner's aesthetics, modern art, and organic architecture. Okay, so as you see, this list of panels appears to be quite broad and inclusive, does it not? But I need to point out that there is at least one very important perspective that is missing here. None of these panels approach Rudolf Steiner from a literary perspective. I must point that out because, as you heard, I am a retired teaching academic with a doctoral training in English and German literatures. And I view Rudolf Steiner through a literary lens. My field of specialty is early German Romanticism and Romanticism generally. And I do have a very strong interest in the high modernist period of European art and literature. And this is indeed the modernist era in which Rudolf Steiner lived and did his original work, and in which he attracted celebrity and enmity. So, If we are trying to answer the question, who is Rudolf Steiner for our 21st century, then, as I would do in any university classroom, from a literary standpoint, as readers, I would argue that we need to start by contextualizing Rudolf Steiner in respect to what he himself admitted was his starting point of inspiration. And that is the literature of early German Romanticism and German idealism. And I'm speaking now of that period in German literature often called die Goethezeit, and those are the years during which the poet Goethe was active. And this includes the early Romantic years during which the poet Novalis was active. These were roughly the very last decades of the 18th century and the early decades of the 19th century. And Goethe and Novalis are especially important to Rudolf Steiner and to his ambitious achievements. But herein lies a problem. We're not really used to reading Rudolf Steiner or Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy as literature or poetry, or applying literary methodologies to help us understand it. And I do often get in trouble, I must say, with my fellow anthroposophists when I point out that anthroposophy is a distinctly German phenomenon. But from a literary standpoint, this is the indisputable truth. Now, even very close students of Rudolf Steiner can be resistant or blind to this literary perspective. And in fact, one can spend one's entire professional life in one of the anthroposophical professions, for example, Waldorf education or biodynamics or medicine or beekeeping. You can spend your whole working life and never bother with the literary source springs of anthroposophy. And maybe that's just fine. After all, who of us stays up late at night reading Goethe or Novalis or Kant or Schelling or Fichte or Schiller, et cetera, just to understand Rudolf Steiner? Or let me put it in another way. These days, if someone has a deep interest in matters of spirit, mind, or ontoepistemology, or questions like, well, what happens to me when I die? Well, youthful inquiring minds in our 21st century, they are more likely to turn directly to the many vibrant Asian wisdom traditions or to learn Tibetan. That's what I would do if I were young. That is how the spirit of our time has inspired them. Persons are far more likely to explore in this direction than they are to run out to the university to learn German so that they can study the mind philosophy of Kant, as I did, or the mind philosophy of the post-Kantians, or Fichte, or German idealism, or Schelling, or Novalis, etc., etc. But that may be true for now, but that was not the case for Rudolf Steiner. Rudolf Steiner leaned very heavily on the literature of German idealism and German early Romanticism, as he frankly told us. This is not my idea. I'm just telling you what he says. And keep this in mind as well. Anthroposophy is a textual lineage. We don't find in Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy a direct line of lineage transmission from teacher to student. We don't have, for example, Shaktipad or Abhisheka ceremonies, for example. Everything depends on one's personal initiative and on one's own personal dedication to a self-guided spiritual quest. And such a quest or questioning takes its inspiration directly from texts, from books. And even though Rudolf Steiner, at the end of his life, became quite involved with the founding of a Christian religious organization, that would be the Christian community. He did always insist that anthroposophy was not a religion and should not be treated as a religion. He emphasized that the Christian community was not a church for anthroposophists or Steiner devotees. And he continued to put a strong emphasis on individual spiritual striving and questioning throughout his life. He was much like the Buddha in that regard. So again, because anthroposophy is a textual lineage, we have even more reason to approach it from a literary perspective, one might argue. But okay, I get it. As I said, many folks don't want to read Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy as literature, or they don't know how to do that. Okay, fine, whatever. What then? If Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy is not a religion and is not to be read as poetry or literature, then what is it? A science? Revealed wisdom? Well, Rudolf Steiner insisted that it was both, and he was a bit coy about it, however. He called anthroposophy a spiritual science, but that too is confusing because in German, here we go again, in German, the word spiritual science that Steiner uses as a synonym for anthroposophy is Geisteswissenschaften, where Geist is spirit and Wissenschaft is science. But this term in German fundamentally means humanities. That's one of the names of my section, literary arts and humanities. When you study at a German university, you have to decide whether to study in the natural sciences, the Naturwissenschaften, or in the humanities, Geisteswissenschaften. But in no way would you assume that Geisteswissenschaften, aka spiritual science in German, means Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy. So is anthroposophy revealed wisdom? Well, my friends, there is indeed a very strong argument that Rudolf Steiner was unique, that he was an initiate. And many people, many of whom are quite distinguished and remarkable in their fields, share this opinion. Rudolf Steiner did encourage this view. He said many times and in many ways that his knowledge came directly from his perceptions of suprasensible spiritual realities and from exalted spirit beings and from high initiate masters, such as, for example, Christian Rosenkreuz. He said that he had the ability to read directly from the imperishable history of cosmos and humanity, which is called the Akashic Chronicle, and that he could do this sort of spiritual scientific research. He could do this while maintaining full waking cognitive daylight consciousness awareness. Eyewitnesses, for example, say that he appeared to be doing this sort of suprasensible research when he lectured. And lecturing was his preferred medium in which he had total mastery. He was a virtuoso. His Christology, for example, derives from his direct clairvoyant readings of the Akashic Chronicle. He said that very, very clearly. And these readings were spoken as lectures, and witnesses report that he appeared to be viewing what he described as he spoke. It must have been a truly remarkable experience. So the Akashic Chronicle was his primary text, as we say in the literary trade. He stated many times that no one is qualified to pass judgment on the results of his clairvoyant, spiritual scientific research who does not possess equivalent capacities. And he also stated that anyone, everyone, can potentially develop these capacities, and he gave detailed advice how to do that. So the question arises, if this is so, and if anthroposophy is a science in that respect, where one researches scientifically from the Akashic Chronicle, let's say, as its primary text, then the question arises, has anyone duplicated Rudolf Steiner's results or readings? Well, I cannot speak to that, but I can say that I know many people who have benefited quite enormously from reading, studying, and practicing Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy, the knowledge of which they acquired from printed texts, from books. So let me point out too that Rudolf Steiner discouraged folks from seeing him as a master or a guru. And I'm using that word guru now in the pejorative Eurocentric meaning that it has for some of us who use it as a term of criticism. Rudolf Steiner always insisted that he wanted individuals to think for themselves and question everything. His ideal was really the Enlightenment era ideal of the free and striving ethical human being who achieves spiritualization through her own efforts of independent inquiry. So I'll read you an amusing quote where he complained about the attitude of many of his students. And he made many such quotes and remarks. And this is a remark that Rudolf Steiner made to one of his close associates in 1914. Let me do a screen share so you can see it again. There we go. It's right over here. Okay, here we are. Let me tell you something, said Rudolf Steiner. If I put on a magician's cloak and ask people to perform the craziest exercise, like running up some mountain at midnight to do something nonsensical, believe me, they would all do it. Everyone would be chasing after me. But to spend years of effort to overcome and set aside just one character weakness or bad habit, well, that's just not interesting, is it? People simply don't believe that a single change in their own behavior, such as a vain person admitting his vanity and becoming ashamed of it, could possibly have more impact on their spiritual progress than listening to hundreds of lectures or committing all of my lecture cycles to memory or whatever. So, as I said at the beginning of my talk, Rudolf Steiner's fame and infamy began with his involvement with the German section of the Theosophical Society at the beginning of the 20th century. The German section of Theosophy transformed into the Anthroposophical Society. Rudolf Steiner was the leader of the German section of Theosophy from 1904 to 1913. And during that time, he acted boldly to rewrite Theosophy. He was a reformer. He was inspired and assisted in that task by his close collaborator, confidant, and partner, and later his wife, Marie von Sievers. Here you see them together during that period. Her contribution, Marie's contributions, by the way, should not be underestimated. And this is especially the case when we talk about the arts, the visual arts, the performing arts, the literary arts, poetry. One of the very important distinguishing aspects of Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy as a unique spiritual path in our 21st century, I would argue, is the critical emphasis that it places on art and on the appreciation of art, the doing of art, art history, and aesthetics. I've talked about this quite a bit in section meetings and in video lectures. Let me stop the screen share for a moment. So Rudolf Steiner was really quite open right from the beginning about his intention to reform the Theosophical Society. And he began to do that from day one by reinterpreting the importance and significance of the esoteric meaning of the Christ mystery. And in many respects, my friends, one can read Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy as a self-identified Rosicrucian teaching of esoteric Christianity. And I don't know, perhaps if we have a course down the line at Kosmos, we can dive more deeply into topics such as Rudolf Steiner's Christology and his revision of theosophy, or his other statements, which maybe align more with the Cosmos mission. For example, that anthroposophy, as anthroposophia, spiritual being, is a renewal of the Isis Sophia mysteries for our time. And as I said, I'm especially interested in a literary approach to these complex themes. But for today, I'm going to finish up. I want to finish up this brief introduction by sharing some reminiscences, actually. I think that's helpful, from people who knew Rudolf Steiner directly. And then I'll close with a very quick photo tour of Rudolf Steiner's life. We should end right on time. So let me just start my screen share again. Okay, there's Marie and Rudolph. Let me get this queued up here. All right. So these appreciative quotes that I'm going to read are even more important today because they give us a good feeling of the direct impact that Rudolf Steiner had as a personality and teacher on his devoted students more than 100 years ago. And many of those students, as I said, could be considered indeed remarkable individuals in their own right, or they could even, some of them, be considered geniuses. So if we were to judge a teacher by the caliber of his students, then Rudolf Steiner would rank very high. Here is a quote by Dr. Ita Wegman, who was a very close associate and a person very important to the anthroposophical medical work. And this quote emphasizes the charismatic power of Rudolf Steiner as a human being. Those with any soul sensitivity at all who met him knew immediately that an important personality stood before them. He was of medium stature and slim build, and he had a spring in his step. His head was well shaped, and his eyes were kind and full of goodwill. He had remarkable eyes. They could shoot sparks when he waxed enthusiastic about goodness, beauty, and truth. He could ignite human hearts when he spoke, because he stood before us as goodness or truth itself. When he looked off into space as if trying to penetrate etheric distances, the observant listener could recognize that Rudolf Steiner's consciousness was expanding, and that Rudolf Steiner was speaking out of a capacity of memory that far transcended the memory of any ordinary human being. One sensed that the man who stood in front of us was different from anyone else. But then again, there was nothing phenomenal about him when one saw him with other people. Then he was sociable, amicable, and gallantly humorous, and able to laugh heartily in spite of his deeply serious nature. And here is another testimony by another pupil of Rudolf Steiner, the Dutch psychiatrist Willem Zeilmans van Emmerhoven, and it gives us a picture of Rudolf Steiner at the lectern, which is very important, as I said, since, as I said, Rudolf Steiner perfected, he really did, he perfected his art of lecturing, and he made an incredible impression as a lecturer. And you get a sense of this, of his personal spiritual power from this description here. When I saw Rudolf Steiner standing up there at the lectern, I had the very strange sensation that I was seeing a human being for the very first time. It is not easy to describe this impression. I had met many famous and distinguished people, professors and important artists, and I had always led a culturally active life in social circles where there was a lot going on. But it was suddenly clear to me that this is what a human being is supposed to be. Well, right away, I began to question my reaction. I asked myself, what do you mean? You've seen plenty of people. So what is that supposed to mean? Well, first of all, it was his entire way of standing there, like a tree growing freely between earth and heaven. It wasn't just his very straight, upright figure. No, it had more to do with the way he held his head, as if it were floating between heaven and earth. Another thing I noticed, his thoughts. I had to admit that I could not always understand those thoughts, but their reason for existing was not simply to be understood. Their importance lay elsewhere. And finally, my friends, this last testimony, these are words from the Russian novelist Andrei Belyi, who was another very close pupil who was associated with Rudolf Steiner in the very important years 1912 to 1916. Now, I should mention maybe that Rudolf Steiner had a very close connection to the Russian soul, especially in respect to his teaching of the Christ mystery, as you will hear in this quote that I'm going to read. And you'll also hear in this quote, Belyi described Rudolf Steiner as a servant of the Grail. Rudolf Steiner himself characterized anthroposophy in his book, An Outline of Occult Science, as a new science of the Grail. Here's a typical quote from that book. We see that the highest imaginable ideal of human evolution results from Grail knowledge. That is, the spiritualization that we achieve through our own work. The cosmos of wisdom is developing into a cosmos of love. And indeed, you know, a study of the Grail and the Grail literature and the Grail traditions, that is a well-developed specialty topic of literary research in anthroposophy. The Goetheanum is built on lands that are very important to the Grail legend. And this might also be of future interest for a Cosmos course. Okay, let's hear Belyi. Rudolf Steiner carried something stern and great, something so great that he appeared stern. He could not put down this greatness, and he carried it within himself everywhere. Imagine something like this. Someone comes from a distant land with an immense and precious load. He comes to give it away, but it becomes evident that those who are to receive the priceless gift have no place where he can lay it down. The place for this gift has been cluttered up during years of inattention and drowsiness. and the failure of the recipients foils the purpose of the gift. And so this someone must remain standing with his precious burden, although he almost breaks under its crushing weight. He must hold on to it, even though he thirsts to put it down for the sake of others. All his work, his stormy activities in the Theosophical Society, and later in the Anthroposophical Society, these only serve to prepare a fitting place that could receive this treasure, and the final attempt to prepare a housing for it was a building, which you see here, the first Goetheanum. But that building, the Goetheanum, was burned down by an arsonist. Rudolf Steiner did not live to see the dedication of the second Goetheanum. He left as he had arrived, and he took the most important part of his treasure away with him. Though he gave so much, enough for decades or maybe centuries, he could have given still more, for his treasure was destined for something far greater. This precious load that was carried by this someone often formed itself, in my mind, said Bellier, into the image of the Holy Grail. And through his life, the doctor carried the Grail before him. And as he walked, and even as he slept, he lifted up his tired arms, supporting the Grail. This is the reason for the tone of sternness and the seal of suffering, says Bellier, an unbearable suffering caused by the impossibility of bringing to realization what he carried within himself. This sternness was, in a manner of speaking, the background of all the expressions of his soul. Here's the young Rudolf Steiner, before the burdens of life had settled in. So I could give you many more anecdotes like this. I have a big, thick book filled with such testimonies. There are very many. But since we don't have much time, and I'm almost done, I always end on time. Let me finish with a few more photos. And as I said, maybe in the future, if people are interested, if causes and conditions are appropriate, maybe we can do a course, dive into one of these topics a little more deeply, if there's enough interest. So let me do my photo tour and then I'll stop. Here's a map of Europe. And I guess you can see my mouse. Over here, I'm circling around Zagreb in what is now Croatia. Rudolf Steiner was born in a little village in this part of Europe down here, and what is now Croatia. Lots of people think of Rudolf Steiner as a German, but he was not. He was Austro-Hungarian. And this is a huge difference, literarily speaking or culturally speaking, when we're talking about the situation in the early 20th century. From a literary standpoint, you're looking at things through a totally different set of lens when you're talking about someone who comes from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which ceased to exist during Rudolf Steiner's life, or someone who's coming from Germany. So as I said, it's very important to keep that in mind, and also to keep in mind, as you see from the map here, that Rudolf Steiner came from very humble origins on the periphery. In fact, in respect to the social, cultural environment of his time, he was an outsider and an overachiever, one could say, striving to work his way toward the center. If you contrast him to Carl Jung, for example, Jung was born in the center and went to the gymnasium and was always kind of on that track. But Rudolf Steiner had a different destiny. So as I said, here's the house in Croatia where he was born. It's a photo taken in the early 20th century. His father, Rudolf Steiner's father, named his firstborn child Rudolph in honor of Emperor Franz Josef's firstborn son and heir to the Habsburg monarchy, whose name was Rudolf. That son died, and it precipitated a crisis which involved, really as part of the involvement leading into World War Rudolf Steiner's father started out in the service. If you're a fan of Downton Abbey, like I am, you know in the service what that means. The father was a gamekeeper on an estate, and he had to flee the service to marry Rudolf Steiner's mother. There might be a little novelette in there, maybe. The father worked for the Austro-Hungarian Railroad at a station, different stations, and here's a picture of one of the very modest rural stations that Rudolf Steiner knew as a child. Here's another map up here at the top showing Vienna. Over here, that's the town where Steiner was born. And the family steadily migrated north towards Vienna, the center of things. Rudolf Steiner had a technical and mathematical education, a very good one. He attended one of the more prestigious technical colleges or schools. It was a little bit like an MIT of its day in Vienna. But he spent all his spare time reading literature and philosophy. This is a picture of his mentor in the literary arts, a very important person in his destiny, as he talks about in his autobiography. This professor in the literary arts fired him with an enthusiasm. Oh, by the way, the professor's the guy, not the woman. These days you wouldn't know, but remember, we're back in the 19th century. So clearly the professor is the dude with the beard, right? Okay, so the professor really was a mentor and guided him to his enthusiasm and knowledge of Goethe and literature. And I spoke of that at the beginning of the talk as well. The professor gave him, for his 21st birthday, this little fairy tale by Goethe as a birthday present. And Rudolf Steiner called this, he worked with it considerably throughout his life. He called this the germinal seed of the anthroposophical movement, this fairy tale by Goethe. And it is indeed a very important text for an understanding of Rudolf Steiner's life and achievements. It's a critical text. Here's a picture of Weimar. His literary mentor also recommended him to his first steady job at the Goethe archives in Weimar. And he became the editor of Goethe's scientific writings for the collected edition of Goethe's work at that time. Here it is. During this time, he wrote his very important Philosophy of Freedom, a foundational book for anthroposophy. He also got his doctorate with a dissertation on Fichte. And quite interestingly, he also became, this is a whole side specialty in itself, Rudolf Steiner's involvement with Nietzsche and Nietzsche's thought world. Very interesting deep dive. He became very well acquainted with the works of Nietzsche and was hired by Nietzsche's sister to work on Nietzsche's literary estate. And he visited the mad Nietzsche and wrote about his impressions meeting Nietzsche. But he did, I think wisely, back away from his involvement with Nietzsche's crazy sister. but Nietzsche's writings influenced him quite deeply at the time. After Weimar, he worked for a time as an editor of a literary magazine for 3 years in Berlin. But like I say, he really wasn't getting anywhere professionally, not until he connected with the Theosophists at the beginning of the 20th century. And Mari von Sievers, whom I talked about previously, played a very important role at this point. And now his fortunes took a decided turn towards success. He had found his audience. The work with Theosophy led to the founding of the anthroposophical movement and societies and the building of the first Goetheanum. Here it is being built. Here it is completed. And here it is in ruins after an arsonist, an enemy of Rudolf Steiner and anthroposophy, burned it down on New Year's Eve, 1922, 1923. Let me just flip back to this other picture here, because if you look in the background, this is a picture of the Arlesheim village. I'll just go off script for a moment to point this out. There's door knocks a little bit up on the hill here where the Goetheanum is, the first and the second. And you're looking down, there weren't trees as there are now. And you see the cathedral in Arlesheim. And Arlesheim and this part of Switzerland is very devotedly Catholic. It must have been a real point of contention to look up from the cathedral in Arlesheim and see this building arising. I just mentioned that to kind of highlight some of the drama of the time. Maybe we can come back to that another time. Anyway, after the Goetheanum burned down, Rudolf Steiner wasn't sure what to do, whether to go forward, whether to retreat. But the crisis led to the rebirth of the Anthroposophical Society at the Christmas conference in 1923-1924. However, that society split apart just a few years after Rudolf Steiner's death. And his death did immediately provoke fierce conflicts among his students. And as I said at the beginning of the talk, he did not name a successor or a lineage heir. Before he died, he did create plans for a second Goetheanum, but he did not live to see it built. And this second Goetheanum, which you're seeing here, is the home for the School for Spiritual Science, in which my section, the section for the Literary Arts and Humanities, is active as a department or a faculty. Okay, well, there's the section website. So that brings us to the end of the talk. I'm done. It's about 45 minutes, as I said. And what you're seeing on the screen here before I stop the screen share is the website, theliteraryarts.com, where you can find more information than you probably want to know about matters related to Rudolf Steiner, anthroposophy, early German Romanticism, and the section conference, which is coming up in San Francisco on May 9th to 12th, very soon, just about a month away. So thank you very much. I appreciate your attention. I'm glad to be here, and I do appreciate that you're interested in Rudolf Steiner. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. That was wonderful. Wonderful introduction to Rudolf Steiner. And I'm going to dive right into my presentation. And something of the richness of Steiner's life is reflected in the fact that I will be talking largely about the latter half of, portion of Steiner's life, end of World War I, post-World War I, which Bruce really didn't speak about too much. And I have a prepared presentation, and then after that, I will also share some thoughts more specifically about the relation between Steiner's anthroposophical vision and the mission of the Kosmos Institute. So, this little talk, Gelareh, am I all set to go forward? All right. Anthroposophy today and tomorrow. Today is the 100th anniversary of Rudolf Steiner's death. After a long illness, Steiner died in the atelier adjacent to the site of the burned-out Goetheanum that, resurrected, now stands as a visible symbol of his Herculean labor on behalf of humankind. Despite its concrete shell, the great double-domed building is no dead monument, no hoary tombstone. It is a living, breathing edifice, one that, along with innumerable humbler ones spread across the face of the globe, helps house the ongoing life of the movement to which Steiner dedicated his multifaceted life. Permuting the nomenclature of the Theosophical Society he first joined and then left, Steiner called the movement that bears the stamp of his vision and character anthroposophy. To honor the man and his legacy, it's my task here to take stock of anthroposophy today and query its prospects for tomorrow. Given the vast scope and depth of all that goes by the name of anthroposophy, this is a difficult, not to say impossible task, one that could hardly be adequately accomplished if I were to command far more knowledge than I possess and hundreds of hours instead of one. How many lectures did Steiner himself give in the course of his life? If we had a pebble for each one, we could pour them into a giant fishbowl and play a guessing game. Those pebbles would number in the thousands, each one bearing witness to the ocean of wisdom that bore it to our shore. One may well remark with incredulity upon the range and variety of topics addressed, the facets of natural, human, and superhuman existence illuminated in Steiner's lectures and books. Cosmogony and Christology, fairy tales and gospel studies, spiritual anthropology and the evolution of consciousness, ancient wisdom streams and mystery schools, medieval mysticism, Rosicrucian esotericism, German idealism and romanticism, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, Goethean science, the cycle of the year, karma and reincarnation, human development and education, the threefold social order. This counts not as a comprehensive, but a partial list of all the weighty matters addressed in Steiner's life and work. Oh, but I have forgotten anthroposophical medicine, the agriculture courses that led to biodynamics, eurythmy, speech and drama. Please fill in the blanks. By the time you are finished, there will scarcely be a field anywhere within the globe of human concern left untouched, and you'll find many freshly deep plowed. How is it humanly possible that one man could teach so presciently upon most everything under the sun, as well as much beyond the solar sphere? Steiner's work does not stand within the range of anything we might regard as a normal or even exceptional degree of human accomplishment. Even detractors can hardly deny that Steiner had access to channels of knowledge unavailable to most persons. If he is not to be written off as a charlatan, a description that can hardly hold water in the face of the undeniable practical fruit of his work, the largest independent school movement in the world, numerous unique communities for the handicapped, an influential style of agriculture that, in addition to superb produce, has spawned award-winning wines that outmatch the storied vintage of France, one can hardly deny Steiner due recognition as a true and truly remarkable seer. That said, I do not much like the accent often placed upon Steiner's so-called clairvoyance, not because I believe he did not have extraordinary powers of perception. He clearly did, but because I do not think the term itself at all precise or particularly useful. Plotinus could perceive supersensible verities, otherwise he could never have written the Aeneads. Was he clairvoyant? Yes, but not after the fashion or in the way that Steiner was, or vice versa. I believe that the mode of knowing given to or attained by any given sage or seer peculiar to that individuality, just as every artist must avail themselves of the power of imagination. But how and to what effect each poet, painter, or musician does so proves utterly unique. Overemphasis upon or misguided conception of Steiner's peculiar capacities can, moreover, obscure more fundamental features of his invaluable legacy. As the word itself implies, anthroposophy centers upon the knowledge innate in our nature, the wisdom, Sophia, of the human being, anthropos. This in marked contrast to theosophy. Steiner did not focus chiefly upon the almighty power and beneficence of God after the fashion of a St. Augustine, or his ineffable and incomprehensible grace like Martin Luther. Rather, Steiner devoted himself to the revelation and cultivation of the spiritual capacities inherent, though as yet incompletely realized, in that first and last wonder of creation, the human being. That endeavor entails detailed knowledge of every aspect of the human entity, the human body and soul along with the spirit, and, above all, the dynamic and intricate interplay characterizing the integral threefold unity comprising our being. That purview includes, too, the human being's relation to the whole cosmos and to the spiritual beings, from elemental spirits to the sublime spiritual hierarchies that order that cosmos. This is necessarily the case insofar as all religions and philosophies representative of a comprehensive worldview or Weltanschauung render account of each of the trinity of terms which, taken together, comprise the entirety of reality: God, divinity by whatever name, man or humankind, and nature or the universe. Even if a given worldview denies the very existence of one of these terms, that very nullification functions as an essential premise of that system of belief. This is transparently so in the case of the worldview that prevails today, and has done so, in the West at least, for several hundred years. The scientific world, which draws the contours of what is typically considered reality today, and which conditions every aspect of our human existence, excludes any factors that cannot be accounted for by way of purely material or physical chains of causation. So the outspoken evolutionary theorist Richard Dawkins proclaims that modern natural science denies the existence of not only the familiar Judeo-Christian deity, but any and all gods, any and everything supernatural. This zealous naturalism not only leaves a void in the place reserved for divinity, this erasure inevitably affects too, and profoundly so, the image of the human being inherent in our modern Darwin-determined system of belief. The human being, in this view, is not the crown of creation, made in the image of that supernal source of being, life, and intelligence some call God, nor are we, as children, born upon the earth as a spiritual being, an immortal soul descended from the starry sphere of heaven. Rather, we are great apes, the cleverest animals ever to have evolved, to be sure. Even so, naught but products of blind, essentially mechanical evolutionary processes, physical and biological laws informed by no conscious intelligence, no higher order wisdom, but mere chance and brute necessity. I take pains to paint this familiar scientific picture here because without grasping the full scope of its nature and implications, the radical and indeed world transformative force of anthroposophy cannot be understood. Steiner did not, of course, subscribe to the mechanistic philosophy spawned by the scientific revolution. Yet scores of spiritual teachers who fit that description could be found in his time as well as our own. Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, to cite just a few signal examples, are ancient spiritual streams that antedate the scientific revolution by more than a millennia. Whatever connections clever moderns can draw between meditation and brain waves, contemplative states of mind and neurophysiology, these teachings are not rooted in the soil of a modern scientific consciousness. The case, however, is otherwise with anthroposophy, another name for which, in Steiner's own parlance, is spiritual science. In German, the term is Geisteswissenschaft, but the meaning Steiner lends the term goes well beyond its usual sense as study of the humanities. Steiner was deliberate and deliberately insistent that anthroposophy represents an essentially modern teaching grounded in not so much the discoveries of modern science as its epistemological means and methods, the cognitive processes entailed in the way of knowing nature, and by extension, the human being, pioneered in the West some 400 years ago. But what does this much touted debt to modern science mean or amount to? It certainly does not mean that anthroposophy adopts a Cartesian or Newtonian epistemology or a Darwinian account of the origin of species. True it is that Steiner, the son of a railway official fascinated by machines, was given a rigorous technical education. True it is that Steiner, an early adherent of Ernst Haeckel's evolutionary theory, was well versed in all facets of the science of his time. Steiner's anthroposophy consequently does not represent the spiritual or religious stream that leaves the objective understanding of nature to modern science, while unfolding its knowledge of spirit and of human consciousness by way of another method proper to another separate sphere. On the contrary, anthroposophy undertakes a fundamental transformation of the way of thinking about nature, and so too about the human being. The soul and nature are inextricably interwoven in this view, inscribed in modern scientific methods and modes of cognition, transfiguring our ways of conceiving and perceiving reality from a point of departure within the modern mindset established by Enlightenment rationalism and the accompanying scientific revolution. I wish to pause here for a moment to make a critical observation. I spoke above of the radical world-transforming vision of anthroposophy. Standing here today, in the world we inhabit 100 years after Steiner's passing, it's necessary to acknowledge that if anthroposophy does represent such a transformative vision, that vision remains, by and large, no accomplished fact, but an as yet unrealized dream, one forestalled by what may well seem a sort of unending nightmare. Not only does our contemporary world remain thoroughly conditioned by scientific materialism, the technological egotism, Chris Bamford's phrase, that philosophy breeds, permeates our lived reality more and more, with ever more destructive effects on human physical, psychological, and spiritual culture. An epidemic of chronic disease of frightening proportions, younger generations addicted to screens, the denigration of non-technical subjects in universities and even elementary school education, and the resultant degradation of culture, a violently polarized body politics that threatens to destroy democracy and rend the fabric of civil society, old animosities exploding into war around the world. These are just a few symptoms of a mind frame, an operating system that bodes forfeiture rather than fulfillment of the dream of a more truly human future. A society premised on the principles of freedom and love, rather than the will to power and control, remains what often appears an ever-dimming prospect, a sputtering flame engulfed in a sea of darkness. Already in his time, Steiner had compelling reason to believe that the world, at least his own European world, needed the potential for the wholesale transformation of life and culture anthroposophy offered, and indeed desperately so. Well before the onset of World War I, Steiner, along with innumerable others, recognized that the materialistic culture spawned by modern science was spiritually bankrupt, and so all too prone to material and political as well as spiritual disaster. By Steiner's own account, the last third of the 19th century represented a kind of acme of materialism, a concluding phase of a long historical process that entailed loss of the ideals and values that had historically nourished the human soul and lent coherence to society. Even as industrialist magnates and robber barons, heirs to the feudal lords of old, accumulated unprecedented fortunes, society at large suffered increasingly acute spiritual as well as material deprivation. Friedrich Nietzsche's declaration of the death of God in his book The Gay Science in 1882 qualifies as a public announcement of what was already a kind of cultural fait accompli. We murder to dissect, Wordsworth had declared a full century before the opening of the 19th century abyss. Science, however, had proceeded to dissect all the more, dividing itself into increasingly insular and specialized departments of research, and thus divvying the world of thought into ever smaller, increasingly unrecognizable pieces in service of the Baconian dictum that, scorning philosophy's time-honored call to soul-edifying wisdom, knowledge is equivalent to power. The exhaustion of traditional sources of religious and artistic value prompted a wide range of attempts to resuscitate an enervated and increasingly decadent culture. Oscar Wilde, for one, broke with a host of once unbreakable norms, championing art for art's sake, a notion that would have been inconceivable in the Middle Ages. The theosophical movement founded by Madame Blavatsky, on the other hand, took the religious beast by the horns and turned to occult and Eastern streams to reestablish contact with the realm of spirit science had banished. Already in his early years, Steiner himself picked up the mantle of romantic idealism, the critique of Enlightenment rationalism that, in the aftermath of the failed French Revolution, rocketed into prominence in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, deeply and consciously indebted to the first, most prescient critics of scientific materialism, heir of Goethe and Schiller, Fichte, Schelling, and Novalis, Steiner offered his version of post-Kantian epistemology, his wedding of a non-dualistic epistemology and ethical individualism under the aegis of A Philosophy of Freedom in 1894. To the end of his life, Steiner regarded this book as if not the, foundational text of what he later called anthroposophy. Despite Steiner's hope for it, the book found scant purchase in his time. An invitation to join the Theosophical Society offered Steiner, prepared at last to appear as a spiritual researcher, an audience receptive to non-mainstream ideas. Donning the mantle of the General Secretary of the German section of the Theosophical Society, Steiner officially commenced his career as public figure and spiritual teacher just after the turn of the century and his own 40th birthday in 1902. The liaison with the Theosophical Society proved constructive for a full decade, in good measure because Steiner, who soon commanded a devoted audience, was left largely free to pursue his own research and teach what and how he saw fit. While not unreceptive to the Eastern currents prevalent in the society, Steiner's own favored brand of esotericism, in accord with his own prior expertise and experience, remained distinctly Western in orientation. Already in 1899, according to Steiner, the end of the Kali Yuga, or Dark Age, Steiner had experienced a life-changing encounter with the Christ, one that led to his pivotal book on esoteric Christianity, Christianity as a Mystical Fact, first published in 1904. In an autobiographical sketch penned in 1907, Steiner outlined what he saw as a right and wrong path out of the impasse faced by a modernity mired in the spiritual desert of materialism. Tellingly, the wrong path fails to accord any pivotal role to the Christ event and involves a forced and artificial synthesis between ancient, especially Indian, esotericism and modern materialistic science. The right path sees anthroposophy, which Steiner at the time designated fruitful modern theosophy, as a dynamic blending of the cognitive processes associated with modern Western science and the Rosicrucian stream representative of an esoteric Christianity. This synthesis envisions science wedded to and transformed by the Western esoteric stream that, as per the historic movement of Rosicrucianism, comprehends science, religion, and art as no separate compartments, but aspects of a unified field of human culture, a way of knowing, feeling, and doing that comprehends all facets of human existence, including social and political life. That is one preliminary, yet very good and proper way of expressing something of the essence of what Steiner later called anthroposophy. It's worth noting, too, that the ideal of fraternity that later found expression in the motto of the French Revolution and subsequently in Steiner's own threefold social order finds influential precedent in the vision of mystic brotherhood and universal humanity integral to the Rosicrucian dream of a society to come. Given Steiner's own orientation, it was quite predictable that when, in 1912, the Theosophical Society put an exclamation point to the priority it accorded to Eastern spiritual streams by endorsing the avatarship of Jiddu Krishnamurti, Steiner felt he had no choice but to break with the society. Soon after, in December of that same year, he founded the Anthroposophical Society to serve as a vehicle of the transformative vision of the wisdom of human being he himself had come to see as an answer to the spiritual and material deficiencies of his time. Those deficiencies were increasingly threatening to come to a head on the political front. Within 2 years, they did in fact do so, unleashing a wave of violence unprecedented in the history of the world. By now, proud science had succeeded in furnishing man with a whole set of new, infinitely more deadly toys. After hostilities commenced in 1914, tanks, airplanes, machine guns, and poisoned gas, none of which had been seen before, helped turn innumerable cathedrals of culture into heaps of rubble, and civilized Europe into a veritable hell on earth. It was, however, not only the bodies of untold soldiers that were tortured and torn to pieces by the great machinery of the First World War. It was the very soul of Europe that was dealt a mortal blow. Faith, not only in God, but in humankind, seemed all but senseless, mercilessly contradicted by the ghastly facts on the ground. The norms and forms of human culture requisite for any civil society, and at a still deeper level, any coherent sense of meaningful existence had, like some once marvelous medieval tapestry, been destroyed beyond recognition, shredded for the sake of the thin threads of gold woven into once vivid scenes of life. If the need for a new vision of humanity had been clear already at the turn of the century, how much more urgent, how much more desperate was that need towards the end of World War I and in the years of its immediate aftermath. Fateful years for all of Europe, but perhaps especially for Germany, which, as the loser, was subjected to crushing economic consequences by the victorious Allied powers. So it was that Rudolf Steiner, responding to the call of destiny, intensified his commitment to anthroposophy and redirected his energies to a host of new initiatives that signified a kind of new second birth of anthroposophy, one that culminated in the formal refounding of the Anthroposophical Society in December 1923, after the burning of the Goetheanum. If Steiner spearheaded new vital endeavors, he did so, as was the rule throughout his life as spiritual guide and teacher, in response to questions and initiatives proposed to him by others. So in 1917, toward the end of the war, the German diplomat Otto von Lerchenfeld requested Steiner's help in envisioning a new foundation for the social and political order that might arise in the wake of the war. This resulted in Steiner drafting memos sketching, for the first time, the ideas underlying his conception of the threefold social order. understanding the cultural, the economic, and the legal or administrative as distinct, if related, spheres, Steiner drew upon the motto of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, in order to envision the set of ideals that could best function as guiding principles for each of these distinct realms. The cultural sphere should be regulated by freedom, no censorship in the realm of art, science, or public discourse. The rights sphere, by the principle of equality, all persons should be treated equally in the eyes of the law, and the economic sphere, by the ideal of fraternity. This is a brilliant conception, but hardly one either readily understood or designed to win easy acceptance, especially in view of the last, least natural pairing. Whenever the threefold social order does receive critical attention, it is usually this last clause that draws the most fire, and advocates of what is touted as free market capitalism roast Steiner as a socialist or worse. Yet the world today shows all too clearly the consequence of associating economic life too religiously with the wrong ideal. Freedom in today's capitalistic society too often translates into the prerogative of the wealthy to rig the rules of the game so that the rich get richer, the poor poorer, and the middle class squeezed to the vanishing point. Steiner's ideas of a threefold social order did in fact receive serious attention, especially, although not exclusively, in Europe. The New York Times wrote an article about it. He lectured widely on the topic, his book elaborating his ideas toward social renewal became a bestseller upon its publication in 1919. Unfortunately, however, conservative and even reactionary forces, the political chaos along with the threat posed by Bolshevism proved the seedbed of National Socialism, eventually seized control. Those regressive developments notwithstanding, not only did Steiner develop the foundations of anthroposophical social thought during these post-war years, the public attention he received bore tangible, if unexpected, fruit. In April 1919, the industrialist Emil Molt invited Steiner to speak to the workers about the threefold social order at his Waldorf Astoria cigarette factory in Stuttgart, Germany. After the lecture, Molt asked Steiner if he would spearhead the founding of a school for the children of the workers. The first Waldorf school opened its doors in Stuttgart a scant 5 months later, in September 1919. The relevant history thus makes perfectly clear that Steiner's ideas about social renewal and Waldorf education were, from the first, bound at the root, the former supplying the original impetus for the latter. Nor did Waldorf schooling represent the only pertinent connection between Steiner's initiatives on behalf of social renewal and younger generations. Amongst the many drawn into the orb of Steiner's influence towards the end and after the war were numerous young people hungry for a fresh, more spiritually nourishing approach to the linked problems of self and society. In Germany, younger people's interest in exploring new ways of life dated back to the Wandervogel movement that emerged around the turn of the century. Camping, hiking in the mountains, singing, dancing, and philosophizing together, these youthful, wandering birds confronted the existential incoherence bred of a materialistic culture and stale social forms. The movement reached a peak in October 1913 when a host of related groups met for a German proto-Woodstock on the Hohe Meissner, a mountain south of Kassel, Germany. The euphoria born of that occasion did not, however, long endure. Factionalism bred of political difference splintered the movement, and the chaos of the war further rigidified political divisions internal to the group. Nonetheless, the movement retained spiritual vitality, and in the aftermath of the war, no few of these younger people found a new voice speaking powerfully to their concerns. That voice was Rudolf Steiner's. Chris Bamford details some of the pertinent history. All Steiner's public, socially oriented activity had to have radical consequences for anthroposophy and the Anthroposophical Society. Among them, perhaps the most significant was the influx of educated, seeking young people who wished, above all, to make a difference with their lives. In this way, a kind of third spiritual stream, beyond left and right, emerged where the Wandervogel had been. These were the young people who were drawn to anthroposophy as a true Lebensreform, reform of life. They wanted to develop spiritually as well as intellectually. They yearned to overcome the separation between everyday life and the disciplines of science, art, history, psychology, religion, and so on. They wanted spiritual life, professional life, and personal life to be a continuum, lived from the same source. On this basis, they wished to change the world. They envisioned anthroposophy as a way of life, self and world transformation in one. Some of these young people went directly to Rudolf Steiner with their dreams and concerns. Steiner wholeheartedly embraced them, despite resistance and even antagonism on the part of many older anthroposophists. In March 1920, select youth leaders issued a call for the foundation of a youth branch, and the next 2 to 3 years saw Steiner and representatives of the youth movement work intensively to find a suitable practical form for the youth initiative. At the request of youth leaders, Steiner gave a series of lectures to and for the younger generation in October 1922. The lectures proved pivotal and led directly to the official founding of a youth branch under the aegis of the Free Anthroposophical Society, a subsidiary for young people within the General Anthroposophical Society, in March 1923. You may at this point be wondering why I am taking time to recount this history. It is because I believe that if we wish to understand anthroposophy today with an eye toward tomorrow, we need comprehend anthroposophy as Rudolf Steiner himself effectively envisioned, or rather re-envisioned it, in the post-war years. That cannot be accomplished without recognition of the signal movements that embodied so much of Steiner's formative work in that period, to the intimately interwoven nexus that includes the initiatives for social renewal, Waldorf education, and a youth branch of the society. I would add as well the movement that culminated in the founding of the Christian community in 1922. If anthroposophy entails a fundamental transformation of what we understand as scientific knowledge, it likewise transfigures the conception of religion generally, and more particularly who or what one may signify when speaking of the Christ. In any event, it's not difficult to justify this focus on this period in Steiner's life and work. His late work builds upon and effectively incorporates foundations laid earlier. There's no threefold social order without the philosophy of freedom. At the same time, the war intensified the sense of emptiness already present at the turn of the century, compelling Steiner to work with a heightened sense of spiritual as well as social emergency. On account of the interest of the younger generation, moreover, the audience to whom he most enthusiastically addressed himself had changed. Chris Bamford begins his introduction to the youth lectures, now published as a book under the title Becoming the Archangel Michael's Companion, highlighting why, however young or old we may be, we should lend the Steiner that speaks in the youth lectures special attention. These lectures, the pedagogical youth course, hold a special place in anthroposophical literature. Even though Rudolf Steiner was speaking in 1922, which seems a long while ago, he was, in a unique way, and for the first time then, as still today, addressing a new generation, us. Why does Bamford make this declaration? Many of the older anthroposophists came to Steiner through theosophy. They were born well before the turn of the century. Younger persons who grew up in the crucible of the new century and whose youth and young adulthood were indelibly marked by the tragedy of the war brought new soul spiritual energies to the quest for social and spiritual renewal, as Steiner himself explained. Bamford again. On the cusp of their adult lives, they had just witnessed and endured the apparent collapse of Western civilization. Wide awake, energetic, committed to the recovery of spiritual meaning in human life, they wanted to do something about it. So much for the so-called past. And the present? Further wars and greater loss of meaning and value, accelerated by the increasing dominance of technological egotism, have extended and consolidated the crisis. But the lessons never learned were and are the same. Their world is our world. The lessons never learned. What are these? First, the principal lessons inscribed in the history of modernity, namely, the catastrophic deficiency of a civilization found upon thoroughly materialistic values. In a time of growing infatuation with dangerous biotechnology and AI, fantasies of colonizing Mars, and the imperial reign of high-tech driven oligarchy, it is all too manifest that those lessons, to our peril, remain unlearned. Yet one can read another sense into Bamford's words as well. One can understand Rudolf Steiner as a man who, above all, sought at precisely that critical post-World War junction to teach those lessons, not merely recognizing the dangerous insufficiency of the prevailing worldview and its disastrous consequences, but striving with courage and deep wisdom to formulate and implement a superior curriculum. Anthroposophy, as Steiner reconceives and amplifies it in the wake of the war, represents a principled alternative to the failed Weltanschauung ruining the world then, as it still does now. It offers a revisioning of the whole of human culture with spiritual as well as practical ends in view, a redemptive vision based upon no puerile dream of some messianic salvation, whether in traditional religious or postmodern transhumanist guise, but rather anchored in our own deepest nature, the divinity indwelling the core of ourselves, the wisdom of the human being. So I want to very briefly, to leave us a little time, just mention a few of the tremendously significant overlaps between Steiner's anthroposophical mission and that of the Kosmos Institute. Before Bruce joins me and we open it to questions, and I will be very brief here. First of all, there's an emphasis on the human being rather than a theistic framework. That emphasis on the human being nonetheless involves both the cosmos or the universe and an idea of Godhead, of divinity, because these three are always interwoven. Nonetheless, that centrality of the human being is threefold of nature, body, soul, and spirit. And if any were here for the prior conference, the vision of a ninefold gnosis I outlined there is premised on Steiner's vision of the threefold human being, a double threefold of thinking, feeling, and willing, and body, soul, and spirit. This implies that there's an esoteric ground to the worldview, and especially a Western esotericism that has a comprehensive understanding of the human being and its place in the world. And it also tries to move towards an integral theory of culture that sees science and art, religion, politics, ethics, and history all as aspects of what I previously called an integral soul wisdom. That is a wisdom of the human being. That implies, too, a framework that takes account of the evolution of consciousness, a specifically modern vision that builds on the achievements of modernity, even while taking keen cognizance of its shadows and deficiencies. Lastly, there's a dedication to an idea of social renewal implicit in all I have said, a social renewal in the name of humanity, but nonetheless a framework that sees education as in either higher education, as in Cosmos, or elementary education in Waldorf, as central to any real social and political renewal, and correlatively understands the spiritual ground of education, the title of one of Steiner's books, so that spiritual awakening figures as both the basis of education itself and possibility for real social renewal. So those are a few points of deep intersection between Steiner's anthroposophical vision and the mission of the Kosmos Institute. And I would love Bruce to join me as we open the floor for our last minutes here for questions and general discussion.